The pit in the floor was 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. It was filled completely with river stones, each one roughly the size of a man's fist. A grid of iron bars sat over the top, and beneath the stones, accessible through a side door, was a firebox. The whole contraption sat in the center of the cabin, taking up valuable floor space and looking, to anyone who saw it, completely absurd. The settlers who visited shook their heads. Some laughed, others just stared in disbelief. A hole in the floor filled with rocks, a fire that burned under rocks instead of in a proper fireplace. It was the most ridiculous heating system anyone in Wyoming territory had ever seen. They called it the rock bed, though not in a complimentary way. They called the man who built it worse things than that. His name was Lars Bergman, a Swedish immigrant who'd arrived in Wyoming in 1879. He was 54 years old, a former ironworker from Stockholm who'd spent 30 years working in foundries and metalworks. He understood heat, understood thermal mass, understood how to store and release energy. None of that mattered to his neighbors. They thought his rock bed was stupid, a waste of time and materials, a guaranteed failure. Then winter came, and Lars's rock bed stayed hot for 14 hours after the fire went out. 14 hours of radiant heat, warming the entire cabin, using a fraction of the firewood his neighbors burned. Suddenly, the stupid rock bed didn't seem so stupid anymore. The mockery had started in August of 1879, when Lars first explained his heating plan to the other homesteaders in the Powder River region. He'd filed his claim in June, selected a good spot with timber and water, and spent July building the cabin shell. Standard log construction, nothing unusual. But when he started excavating a large pit in the center of his cabin floor, people took notice. His nearest neighbor, a man named Thomas Whitaker, who'd been in Wyoming for 3 years, rode over to see what Lars was doing. He found Lars digging, creating a rectangular pit that went down 2 feet into the earth. "What are you building there?" "Some kind of root cellar?" Whitaker asked. Lars paused his digging and wiped his forehead. "No, not root cellar. This is for heating, for rocks. I will fill with stones, heat them with fire from below, and they will warm the cabin for many hours." Whitaker stared at him. "You're going to heat rocks? To warm your cabin? That's your plan?" Lars nodded. "Yes, rocks hold heat very well. Much better than air, better than most things. I heat them once, they stay warm very long time, all night perhaps." Whitaker shook his head slowly. "That's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You know what holds heat? A fireplace, a stove, normal things that people have been using for hundreds of years. You're wasting your time digging a hole and filling it with rocks." Lars smiled patiently. "We will see. In Sweden, in the ironworks, we use rocks for heat many times. They work very well." "But this is Wyoming, not Sweden," Whitaker said, "and rocks are rocks. They don't stay warm. They cool down just like everything else. You're going to freeze this winter because you built some fool contraption instead of a proper fireplace." Lars just nodded and continued digging. Word spread quickly. The Swede was building a rock bed for heating. People came to look, to offer opinions, to predict disaster. Most thought Lars had lost his mind. A few were simply curious about what would happen when his strange system inevitably failed. But Lars kept working. The pit was completed by mid-August, a precise rectangular excavation 2 feet deep. He'd been careful to dig with straight sides and a level bottom. The dimensions mattered. Too shallow and the rock mass wouldn't be sufficient. Too deep and heat would be wasted heating the earth below. 2 feet was the right depth for his purposes. Next came the firebox. Lars built this with fire bricks he'd brought from Cheyenne, expensive but necessary. The firebox was essentially a small furnace built into one end of the pit, with an opening that extended outside the cabin wall. This design meant he could feed the fire from outside, preventing smoke and ash from entering the living space. The firebox was 2 feet square and 18 inches deep, with a grated bottom for airflow and a chimney that rose through the cabin wall. The walls of the firebox were double-layered fire brick with an air gap between for insulation. The construction was meticulous. Lars had built furnaces before. He knew that a poorly built firebox would crack, leak, or fail. This one was built to last. Above the firebox, spanning the entire pit, Lars installed a grid of iron bars. He'd made these himself, using skills from his ironworking days. Each bar was 1 inch thick and spaced 3 inches apart, creating a grate strong enough to support the weight of rocks and stable enough to support a person walking across it. The grid would hold the rocks while allowing heat to rise from the firebox below. It would also serve as the cabin floor over the pit, with wooden planks laid across the iron bars. Then came the rocks. Lars spent 2 weeks gathering them from the nearby river. He was particular about his selection. He wanted river stones, rounded and smooth from water action. These stones were less likely to have internal fractures or moisture pockets that could cause them to crack or explode when heated. He wanted stones of uniform size, roughly 5 to 7 inches in diameter. Smaller stones would pack too tightly, restricting airflow. Larger stones would leave too many gaps, reducing the thermal mass. He collected approximately 800 stones, each one inspected and approved. Cracked stones were rejected. Stones with visible layers or stratification were rejected. Only solid, uniform river stones made the cut. His neighbors watched this process with increasing amusement. He's collecting rocks, like a child. What's he going to do next? Start a rock collection? But Lars ignored them. He knew what he was doing. Each stone was washed to remove dirt and debris, then set out to dry completely. Moisture in stones was dangerous. When heated rapidly, trapped water could turn to steam, building pressure that could shatter the stone. Lars wasn't taking that risk. By early September, the stones were ready. Lars began filling the pit, carefully layering the stones to maximize contact while maintaining air gaps for heat circulation. The bottom layer went in first, stones placed tightly but not jammed together. Then another layer, with stones positioned to bridge the gaps in the layer below. This pattern continued until the pit was filled to within 6 inches of the top of the iron grid. The final count was approximately 800 stones, totaling roughly 4,000 pounds, or 2 tons of rock. The thermal mass was enormous. Above the rock bed, Lars built a removable wooden floor, individual boards laid across the iron grid, not nailed down so they could be removed if he ever needed to access the rocks below. The floor sat directly on the iron bars, with small gaps between boards to allow heat to rise. A person walking on this floor would be walking on wood, supported by iron, supported by tons of heated stone. The cabin floor was literally a heat battery. The final element was ventilation control. Lars built adjustable vents in the cabin walls, small openings that could be opened or closed with wooden slides. These vents would allow him to control airflow during heating and prevent excess heat loss during the release phase. The entire system was completed by late September. The cabin was ready for winter, and Lars was ready to prove his neighbors wrong. Thomas Whitaker visited to see the finished product. He walked across the wooden floor, feeling the boards flex slightly on the iron bars beneath. He looked at the firebox opening in the exterior wall, looked at the chimney, looked at the arrangement. "I still think you're crazy," Whitaker said. "You've spent weeks building this thing. And for what? So you can heat rocks?" "How is that better than a regular fireplace?" Lars explained patiently. "A fireplace. The heat goes up the chimney. Much heat is wasted. And when fire goes out, the heat is gone very quickly. My rocks, they capture the heat. They hold it. They release it slowly over many hours. I burn fire for 3-4 hours. The rocks stay warm all night. Maybe longer." Whitaker was skeptical. "Rocks don't stay warm that long." "Nothing does." "We'll know in a few months," Lars said. "When winter comes, we'll know." The first test came in early October, when temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Other settlers were already running their fireplaces and stoves in the evenings. Lars decided to test his rock bed. He started a fire in the firebox at 2 in the afternoon. He used dry pine, good burning wood that produced intense heat. The fire burned hot and fast, with flames visible through the grates in the firebox. The heat rose through the rock mass, warming the stones from below. Lars fed the fire steadily for 4 hours, maintaining high heat. By 6 in the evening, he let the fire die down. By 7, the fire was completely out, reduced to ashes. The test would now show whether his system worked. At 7 in the evening, Lars placed his hand on the wooden floor above the rock bed. The wood was warm, noticeably warm. He removed one of the floorboards and felt the iron bars below. They were hot, too hot to touch for more than a second. He reached down with a long stick and touched one of the upper stones. The stone was extremely hot, probably around 200 degrees Fahrenheit or more. The heat storage phase had worked. Now for the release phase. Lars monitored the temperature throughout the evening. At 8 o'clock, the floor was still warm. At 9 o'clock, still warm. At 10 o'clock, warm. He went to bed at 11, and the cabin was comfortably warm, probably around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the fire having been out for 4 hours. He woke at 1 in the morning and checked. The floor was still warm. The cabin temperature was around 62 degrees, cooler than before but still comfortable. He woke again at 5 in the morning. The floor was still noticeably warm, though not hot. The cabin temperature was around 58 degrees, cool but not cold. Outside temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock bed had kept the cabin 30 degrees warmer than outside temperature for 10 hours after the fire went out. Lars was satisfied but wanted to test further. The next day, he ran another test, this time with more precise measurements. He borrowed a thermometer from a settler who'd been a pharmacist back east. He heated the rock bed again for 4 hours in the afternoon, achieving even higher temperatures in the stone mass. Then he tracked the heat release carefully. 7 in the evening, fire out. Floor surface temperature 110 degrees. Fahrenheit. Cabin air temperature 72 degrees. 8 in the evening. Floor surface temperature 95 degrees. Cabin air temperature 68 degrees. 9 in the evening. Floor surface temperature 85 degrees. Cabin air temperature 65 degrees. 10 in the evening. Floor surface temperature 78 degrees. Cabin air temperature 63 degrees. 11 in the evening. Floor surface temperature 72 degrees. Cabin air temperature 60 degrees. Midnight. Floor surface temperature 68 degrees. Cabin air temperature 58 degrees. 1 in the morning. Floor surface temperature 65 degrees. Cabin air temperature 57 degrees. 3 in the morning. Floor surface temperature 60 degrees. Cabin air temperature 55 degrees. 5 in the morning. Floor surface temperature 58 degrees. Cabin air temperature 54 degrees. 7 in the morning. Floor surface temperature 56 degrees. Cabin air temperature 53 degrees. 9 in the morning, 14 hours after the fire went out. Floor surface temperature 54 degrees. Cabin air temperature 52 degrees. The rock bed had stayed measurably warm for 14 hours. The cabin had remained comfortable through the entire night. Outside temperature had dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin stayed nearly 30 degrees warmer. Lars had his proof. The system worked exactly as he'd calculated. Word of Lars's successful tests spread through the settlement. Some neighbors remained skeptical. Maybe it worked for one night, but what about deep winter? What about when it's 20 below outside? Others were intrigued. If the rock bed really worked as Lars claimed, it would save enormous amounts of firewood and labor. Thomas Whitaker visited again, this time more curious than dismissive. So it actually worked. The rocks stayed warm all night. Lars nodded. 14 hours. From 7 at night until 9 in the morning, the rocks were releasing heat. The cabin stayed comfortable the entire time. Whitaker frowned, trying to understand. But how? How do rocks hold heat that long? Lars explained. Think about Blacksmith Forge. The stones around the forge, they stay hot long time after fire's out, yes? Whitaker nodded. Yeah, I've seen that. So imagine if you had many hundreds of those hot stones, all together in a big mass. Each stone holds heat. Together, they hold very much heat. And because they are all together, they keep each other warm. The stones in the center cool very slowly because they are surrounded by other warm stones. The heat comes out gradually, over many hours. That actually makes sense, Whitaker admitted. But don't you have to burn a lot of wood to heat all those stones? Lars shook his head. No, not so much. I burn 4 hours of fire. Maybe 40-50 pounds of wood. My fire is very hot, very efficient, because all the heat goes into the stones. Nothing is wasted going up a chimney. In a normal fireplace, you burn wood all night, maybe 150-200 pounds of wood, and much of the heat goes up the chimney. My way uses less wood, but gives more heat. Whitaker was silent for a moment, thinking, if that's true, you're going to save a lot of work this winter. I'm going to be out cutting wood in the snow, and you'll be sitting in your warm cabin. Lars smiled. Perhaps you should build rock bed too. I can help you. I'll think about it, Whitaker said. The deep cold arrived in December. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Lars's rock bed continued to perform. He established a routine. Every afternoon around 2 or 3 o'clock, he'd start a fire in the firebox. Hot, intense fire for 3 to 4 hours. By evening, the rock mass would be thoroughly heated. He'd let the fire go out, and the rocks would radiate heat through the night and into the next morning. On very cold nights, when temperatures dropped to 20 below or colder, the cabin would cool more than on moderate nights. But it still remained far warmer than outside, and far warmer than his neighbors' cabins after their fires went out. Lars calculated his wood consumption. He was burning approximately 1.5 cords of wood per month during the coldest part of winter. His neighbors were burning 3 to 5 cords per month. He was using 1/3 to 1/2 as much wood, and his cabin was more consistently comfortable. The savings in labor were enormous. Instead of cutting and hauling 5 cords per month, he was cutting and hauling 1.5 cords. That was 70 fewer hours of brutal winter labor, time he could spend on other tasks or simply resting in his warm cabin. The comfort level was also superior. In a cabin heated by fireplace or stove, the temperature fluctuates dramatically. Hot near the fire, cold away from it. Hot when the fire is burning, cold when it goes out. Lars's rock bed provided radiant heat from below, warming the entire floor evenly. The heat rose naturally, warming the whole cabin uniformly. And because the heat release was gradual, the temperature stayed relatively stable through the entire night. No middle-of-the-night waking to add wood to a dying fire. No morning wake-up in a frozen cabin. Just consistent, comfortable warmth from evening to morning. By January, 3 other settlers had started building their own rock beds. Thomas Whitaker was one of them. He excavated a pit in his existing cabin, a difficult job made harder by frozen ground and the need to work inside the cabin. But he persevered, motivated by watching Lars live in comfort while Whitaker himself froze and exhausted himself hauling wood. Another settler, a younger man named James Peterson, built his rock bed into a new cabin he was constructing. He followed Lars's design closely, using river stones of the proper size, building a well-insulated firebox, creating proper airflow. His rock bed performed almost as well as Lars's, staying hot for 12 to 13 hours. The third settler, an older Norwegian named Olaf Hansen, tried to save money by using irregular stones from a quarry instead of smooth river stones. He also built a shallower pit, only 18 inches deep instead of 2 feet. His rock bed worked, but not as well. It stayed hot for only 8 to 9 hours, and several of his stones cracked from thermal stress. Hansen learned the lesson the hard way. The details mattered. Proper materials, proper construction, proper depth, all of these factors affected performance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten thermal engineering from the frontier and want to see more stories about the clever heating solutions our ancestors developed, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are so many more incredible innovations waiting to be discovered. Lars became a consultant of sorts, helping settlers design and build their own rock beds. He never charged for this help. He believed good knowledge should be shared freely. He would visit a settler's cabin, assess the floor strength, calculate the right pit size, advise on stone selection, and help with firebox construction. Some settlers followed his advice precisely. Others cut corners or made modifications. The results varied accordingly. One settler tried using wood coals directly on top of the rocks instead of using a separate firebox. The ashes and debris contaminated the rock bed, reduced airflow, and created a smoky mess. The settler eventually rebuilt using Lars's proper firebox design. Another settler tried to save effort by filling his pit with whatever rocks were handy, including limestone and sandstone. These softer sedimentary rocks cracked and crumbled under thermal stress. Within a month, his rock bed was filled with broken rock fragments instead of solid stones. He had to empty the entire pit and refill it with proper river stones. These failures reinforced the importance of proper technique. Lars's design worked because he'd thought through every detail. The stone selection, the pit dimensions, the firebox construction, the airflow, the heating schedule, all of it mattered. Copy the design correctly and it worked beautifully. Cut corners and it failed. The science behind Lars's rock bed is straightforward thermodynamics. Rock has relatively high heat capacity and thermal mass. Depending on the type of rock, the specific heat capacity ranges from about 0.2 to 0.3 calories per gram per degree Celsius. This is lower than water, which is 1 calorie per gram per degree Celsius, but rock is much denser. A cubic foot of rock weighs roughly 160 pounds. A cubic foot of water weighs about 62 pounds. So by volume, rock and water have similar heat storage capacity. Lars's rock bed contained approximately 32 cubic feet of rock, roughly 5,000 pounds or 2.5 tons. If heated from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, a 250-degree temperature increase, the rock mass would store approximately 312,500 kilocalories, or roughly 1.24 million BTUs. For comparison, burning 1 pound of wood produces about 7,000 BTUs. The heat stored in Lars's heated rock bed was equivalent to burning about 177 pounds of wood, but Lars only burned about 50 pounds of wood to heat the rock bed. How was this efficient? Because in a normal fireplace, most of the heat goes up the chimney. Perhaps only 20 to 30% of the wood's energy actually heats the cabin. In Lars's system, almost all the heat went into the rocks. The firebox was designed to maximize heat transfer to the rock mass. Very little heat escaped up the chimney. This meant that 50 pounds of wood in Lars's system provided more useful heat than 150 pounds in a conventional fireplace. The heat release was equally important. Hot rocks radiate heat as infrared radiation. This radiant heat warms objects and people directly, not just the air. It feels comfortable at lower air temperatures because your body is absorbing radiant heat. The rocks also warmed the air through conduction and convection. Air flowing around the hot stones was heated and rose naturally, creating circulation. The wooden floor above the rocks acted as a heat exchanger. The wood absorbed heat from the rocks and iron bars below, then radiated that heat upward into the cabin. The floor itself became a radiant heating panel, warming the entire room from below. This bottom-up heating was more efficient than heating from a fireplace on a wall. Heat naturally rises. A floor-level heat source warms the entire room as the heated air rises. A wall-mounted fireplace creates hot zones near the fireplace and cold zones across the room. The thermal mass effect meant heat release was gradual and sustained. The outer stones cooled first, radiating their heat into the cabin air and into the stones next to them. The middle stones stayed hot longer, insulated by the cooler stones around them. The core stones stayed hot the longest, sometimes remaining above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 to 16 hours. This gradual cooling meant heat was released steadily over many hours rather than all at once. Modern radiant floor heating systems use the same principles Lars demonstrated. Hot water circulates through pipes under the floor, warming the floor surface, which then radiates heat into the room. The experience is similar to Lars's rock bed, comfortable radiant heat from below, even temperatures throughout the room, efficient use of energy. Lars achieved this with rocks and fire. Modern systems use pumps and boilers, but the principle is identical. Lars's system had one major advantage. It required no external energy beyond the initial fire. No electricity, no pumps, no complex controls. Once heated, the rocks did their job automatically, releasing heat through natural physical processes. The system was completely passive, completely reliable, and completely foolproof. The seasonal performance of Lars's rock bed was interesting. In fall and spring, when heating needs were moderate, Lars could often skip days between firings. One firing would keep the cabin comfortable for 36 to 48 hours because the outside temperatures weren't extreme. In deep winter, when temperatures were far below zero, he fired daily. But even then, 1 4-hour firing per day was sufficient. He never needed to run continuous fires like his neighbors did. In severe cold snaps, when temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 below zero, Lars would occasionally run 2 firings per day, one in early morning and one in evening. But these extreme conditions were rare. Most of the winter required only one daily firing. The maintenance requirements were minimal. Once or twice per winter, Lars would rake out the ashes from the firebox. The rocks never needed maintenance. They just sat there, doing their job year after year. Some surface stones developed cracks after repeated heating cycles, but this was normal and didn't affect performance. Deep stones showed no damage at all. Lars used his rock bed for 18 years, from 1879 until 1897. During that time, he replaced perhaps 50 of the 800 stones that had cracked badly enough to warrant replacement. The rest were still functioning perfectly after nearly 2 decades of use. The cost comparison between Lars's system and conventional heating was striking. Initial construction of the rock bed cost approximately $60, including materials for the firebox, iron bars, and labor. A conventional fireplace cost about $30 to $40 to build. So Lars paid perhaps $20 to $30 extra up front. But the annual savings were significant. Lars burned approximately 9 cords of wood per 6-month winter season. At $3 per cord, that was $27 per year. His neighbors burned 20 to 30 cords, costing $60 to $90 per year. Lars saved $30 to $60 per year on fuel costs. The extra construction cost paid for itself in the first year. Over 18 years, Lars saved approximately $540 to $1,080 on heating costs compared to his neighbors. That was a substantial sum of money on the frontier, potentially representing a year or more of cash income for a settler family. The labor savings were equally valuable, though harder to quantify. Lars spent perhaps 15 days per year cutting and hauling wood. His neighbors spent 45 to 60 days per year on the same task. Lars had 30 to 45 extra days per year for other activities. Over 18 years, that was 540 to 810 days, nearly 2 to 2.5 years of additional productive time. This time could be spent improving the homestead, hunting, trapping, or engaging in income-generating activities. The economic value was significant. By the mid-1880s, Lars's rock bed design was known throughout the Powder River region. Roughly 20 to 30 settlers had built their own versions with varying degrees of success. The technique had spread to neighboring regions as well, carried by travelers and mentioned in letters. A newspaper article in the Cheyenne Daily Leader in 1886 described Lars's system, calling it an ingenious method of heating developed by a Swedish immigrant. The article included basic instructions and noted the fuel savings. This publicity brought more visitors to Lars's cabin, people wanting to see the rock bed for themselves. Lars welcomed them all, explained the system, and offered advice. Some visitors were journalists or writers collecting frontier stories. One was a professor from the University of Michigan who was studying frontier technology. The professor, Dr. Edward Harrison, spent 2 days with Lars in January of 1887, measuring temperatures, calculating heat capacity, and documenting the system in detail. Dr. Harrison's report, published in a scientific journal later that year, confirmed Lars's claims. The rock bed stored substantial heat and released it gradually over 12 to 16 hours. The system was thermally efficient, converting most of the input fuel energy into useful heat, and the construction methods, while requiring care and skill, were within the capabilities of most settlers. Dr. Harrison concluded that rock bed heating represented a significant improvement over conventional frontier heating methods and recommended wider adoption. The recommendation had limited impact. By the late 1880s, manufactured cast iron stoves were becoming widely available and affordable. These stoves were more efficient than open fireplaces and didn't require the construction effort of a rock bed. Coal was also becoming available through expanding rail networks. Coal produced more heat per pound than wood and was easier to store and handle. The frontier was changing. Towns were growing. Infrastructure was improving. The desperate fuel-saving measures that made rock beds attractive were becoming less necessary. But for the settlers who'd built rock beds, the systems continued providing value. Lars used his until 1897, when he moved to a larger house in town. Thomas Whitaker used his until 1903. James Peterson used his until 1912, at which point he was an old man, and his original cabin was being replaced by his son. The rock beds that were properly built lasted decades. They remained functional and effective year after year, requiring virtually no maintenance, providing reliable heat at minimal cost. This longevity was part of their value. A rock bed built properly in 1880 was still working perfectly in 1900, after 20 years of continuous use. Few heating systems could claim such durability. Lars Bergman lived until 1921, dying at the age of 96. He'd been in Wyoming for 42 years, witnessing the transformation from frontier territory to established state. He'd seen the arrival of railroads, electricity, automobiles, all the changes that marked the turn of the century. But he always remembered his first winter in that cabin, heated by nothing but rocks and fire, comfortable and warm while his neighbors froze and exhausted themselves. That rock bed, mocked as stupid by everyone who saw it, had been his greatest engineering achievement. Not because it was complex or sophisticated, but because it was simple, effective, and proved that understanding basic principles could solve difficult problems. Before we continue with the legacy of this remarkable heating innovation, if this story of frontier engineering ingenuity has captured your interest and you want to discover more forgotten technologies that solved real problems with elegant simplicity, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. There are countless more stories of innovation waiting to be told. The long-term influence of Lars's rock bed design is difficult to trace with precision. How many were built? How long were they used? The exact numbers are lost to history, but references to rock bed heating appear in various frontier documents from the 1880s and 1890s. Homesteader guides mention the technique. Letters and diaries describe rock beds in use. The knowledge clearly spread beyond Lars's immediate community. One interesting application appeared in the Black Hills gold mining camps in the 1880s. Miners, living in rough cabins during harsh winters, adopted rock bed heating because fuel was expensive and difficult to obtain in the mountains. They modified Lars's design, using smaller pits and less rock mass, but the principle remained the same. Heat rocks during the day, release heat at night. Another application was in remote line shacks used by cattle ranchers. These small cabins, used by cowboys checking livestock in winter, were difficult to keep warm because they were only occupied intermittently. A rock bed could be heated before the cowboy arrived, providing warmth for the night without requiring constant fire tending. Some ranchers built rock beds specifically for this purpose. The technique even reached indigenous communities. Some Native American groups in the region, already using hot rocks for sweat lodges and cooking, adapted the rock bed concept for winter heating. They built pits filled with stones near or under their lodging, heated the stones with fire, and used the radiant heat for warmth. This represented a fusion of traditional knowledge and frontier innovation. But by the early 1900s, rock bed heating was declining. The spread of railroad networks made coal cheaply available. The mass production of cast iron stoves provided affordable, efficient heating. Rural electrification eventually brought electric heaters. The labor-intensive method of heating with wood became less common, and with it, the techniques developed to use wood efficiently. Techniques like Lars's rock bed faded from use. By the 1930s, very few rock beds remained in use. Most had been abandoned when cabins were replaced with modern houses. Some were simply covered over, buried under new flooring. A few were deliberately destroyed to make room for more conventional heating systems. The knowledge became obscure. By mid-century, few people remembered that rock beds had ever existed. Lars Bergman's name was forgotten outside of local Wyoming history circles. His innovation, which had saved hundreds of settlers countless hours of labor and enormous amounts of fuel, vanished from collective memory. But in recent decades, there's been renewed interest in low-tech, sustainable heating methods. The off-grid living movement, the natural building movement, and the appropriate technology movement have all looked back at historical techniques for inspiration. Rock bed heating has been rediscovered by some practitioners. Modern versions use similar principles, but may incorporate improvements. Some use insulated containers instead of open pits. Some use ceramic thermal storage instead of rocks. Some add heat recovery systems or fans to circulate air. But the core principle remains identical to what Lars demonstrated. Heat a mass of material. Let it release heat gradually. Minimize fuel consumption. A particularly interesting modern application is in rocket mass heaters. These highly efficient wood-burning heaters use a thermal mass, often made of cob or masonry, to store heat from a super-hot fire. The fire burns for a short time, heating the mass, which then radiates warmth for hours. The similarity to Lars's rock bed is obvious. The rocket mass heater is essentially a refined, optimized version of what Lars built in 1879. Some modern natural builders have constructed floor systems nearly identical to Lars's original design. They excavate pits, fill them with stone or masonry, heat the mass with a wood fire, and use the radiant floor heat to warm their homes. They've discovered independently what Lars knew. It works. It's efficient, it's reliable. The vindication of Lars's design, more than a century after he built it, proves that good ideas don't expire. The physics of heat storage haven't changed. Rock still has the same thermal properties. Fire still produces the same heat. The principles Lars understood and applied are timeless. What changes is our awareness and appreciation of these principles. The story of Lars and his rock bed follows a familiar pattern. Initial mockery, demonstrated success, gradual acceptance, eventual obsolescence, and finally rediscovery. This pattern appears repeatedly in the history of technology. Good ideas are often ridiculed initially. People are comfortable with familiar methods and suspicious of innovation. The innovator must have courage to persist despite skepticism. Then, when the innovation proves successful, it's adopted by early adopters who see the benefits. Gradually, the innovation spreads to a wider population. It becomes accepted practice, even conventional wisdom. But then conditions change. New technologies appear, the innovation becomes obsolete, replaced by something newer or different. It's forgotten, until eventually changed conditions or renewed interest lead to rediscovery. The innovation is found again, often independently, and recognized as valuable. Lars's rock bed has completed this full cycle, from mockery to acceptance to obsolescence to rediscovery. The underlying value was always there, only our awareness of it has changed. The lessons from Lars's story are applicable beyond heating systems. They speak to the value of understanding principles rather than just following tradition. Lars understood thermodynamics. He knew that mass stored heat and released it slowly. This understanding let him design something better than conventional solutions. They speak to the importance of proper implementation. Several settlers tried to copy Lars's rock bed, but failed because they cut corners or didn't understand the details. The devil is in the details. Good design requires attention to every element. They speak to the courage required to ignore mockery and trust your own knowledge. Lars was ridiculed, but he knew his calculations were sound. He built his rock bed despite the skepticism. His vindication proved that evidence matters more than opinion. They speak to the value of generosity in sharing knowledge. Lars taught anyone who wanted to learn. He never hoarded his innovation or tried to profit from it. His willingness to share meant more people benefited from the design, and they speak to the importance of preserving knowledge. Lars's rock bed nearly vanished from history. If not for a few references in old documents, if not for the one preserved example, the technique might have been completely lost. We should be actively documenting and preserving traditional knowledge before it disappears. The practical applications of rock bed heating remain relevant today. Anyone with access to rocks, fire, and basic building skills can construct a thermal storage heating system. Off-grid homesteaders can use it to reduce wood consumption. Emergency preparedness enthusiasts can incorporate it into backup heating plans. Sustainable builders can include it in natural homes. The technique is adaptable to many situations. Modern materials offer opportunities for improvement. Insulated containers can reduce heat loss. Dense masonry materials can increase heat storage per unit volume. Fans can enhance heat distribution. But these improvements are refinements. The basic concept Lars demonstrated works with the simplest materials and methods. The comparison between Lars's experience and his neighbor's experience during that first winter tells the whole story. Lars's cabin stayed warm through 14-hour cycles on a single daily firing. He burned a cord and a half of wood per month. He spent minimal time on wood cutting. His cabin was consistently comfortable, with radiant heat warming the entire space evenly. He slept through the night without waking to tend fires. He woke to a warm cabin every morning. His neighbors burned continuous fires. They used 3 to 5 cords per month. They spent huge amounts of time cutting wood. Their cabins fluctuated between too hot near the fire and too cold away from it. They woke multiple times to add wood. They woke to frozen cabins. The difference was dramatic. Same environment, same resources available, wildly different outcomes. The only difference was knowledge. Lars understood thermal mass and heat storage. His neighbors didn't. That knowledge gap created a comfort gap, a labor gap, and an economic gap. This is the power of understanding principles. It allows you to see solutions others miss, to design systems others can't imagine, to live better while working less hard. The rock bed stayed hot for 14 hours. That simple fact, which seemed impossible to Lars's neighbors when he first described it, was the foundation of his success. 14 hours of heat from a 4-hour fire. That's a 14-to-4 ratio, or 3.5 to 1. For every hour of fire, Lars got 3.5 hours of heat. This efficiency, achieved through nothing but rocks and intelligent design, surpassed anything his neighbors could achieve with their conventional methods. The stupid rock bed wasn't stupid. It was brilliant. The floor filled with rocks wasn't a waste of space, it was a heat battery. The man who built it wasn't a fool. He was an engineer who understood what others didn't. Everyone mocked his stupid rock bed. They laughed at the pit in the floor, at the tons of river stones, at the firebox heating rocks instead of air. They predicted failure, predicted freezing, predicted disaster. Then it stayed hot for 14 hours. Then the cabin was warm all night. Then Lars used a quarter of the firewood his neighbors did. Then the mockery stopped. Then the learning began. Then the innovation spread. That's always how it happens. Innovation is ridiculed until it succeeds. Then it's obvious. Lars Bergman's rock bed was stupid until it worked. Then it was genius. The neighbors who mocked him ended up building their own rock beds. The skeptics became students. The critics became disciples. Because evidence doesn't care about opinions, the rock bed stayed hot for 14 hours. The thermometer didn't lie. The wood consumption was measurably less. The comfort was undeniable. You can argue with theories, but you can't argue with results. Lars had results. The rock bed worked. Everything else was just noise. The story of Lars and his rock bed is ultimately about the triumph of knowledge over ignorance, of evidence over assumption, of innovation over tradition. It's about a man who saw a problem, understood the principles needed to solve it, had the courage to build something different, and the generosity to share what he'd learned. The rock bed is gone. Lars is gone. But the principle remains true. Mass stores heat. Fire releases energy. Intelligence applies both to solve problems. That truth worked in 1879 in a cabin in Wyoming. It works now. It will work in the future. The materials may change. The methods may evolve. But the physics remains constant. And anyone who understands that physics can heat their home with a fraction of the fuel others require, just like Lars did, with a pit full of rocks, that everyone said was stupid, until it stayed hot for 14 hours. Then nobody was laughing anymore.